bed, and in order to lobby their own decision, their own solution to the Venezuelan crisis. And meanwhile, there is no clear progress, no clear achievements of the United States policy in other regions of the world. They probably will try to use the situation for their own interests. And I'd like to remind you that the United States have promised a lot in the Middle East. For example, we're still waiting for the deal of the century. We're still waiting for the total elimination of the ISIS that was mentioned. We're still waiting for global solutions in the Korean Peninsula that were promised, but nothing is happening. No positive progress is seen anywhere, and the same happens in Cuba, for example, that when the United States wants to show off in the international arena, and they send like a big business delegation to Cuba and drafted a number of high-profile projects, and then it all turned out to be a bluff and a disillusion, a big lie. And probably we're talking about a similar thing, and we don't want anything similar to happen. Okay. Question. Sofia channel. Another question about Venezuela. Answer. Well, actually, the woman over there was supposed to ask me a question here. Good afternoon, RIA Novosti, and the question is the following about the comment of Vice Minister Zubov on the helicopters carrying ISIS combatants to the border of Afghanistan and Tajikistan. Okay, we saw those statements, those quotes. I think they just slip of the tongue because the ISIS combatants are being carried to the borderline between Afghanistan and Tajikistan from the Afghan theory, and we cooperate closely with Pakistan in fighting terrorism as well as on the Afghan agenda, and we share common concerns regarding that ISIS gaining momentum on the territory there and the externally fueled expansion of the terrorist group. As for other partners on the CIS and others, we are very concerned. When it comes to terrorist issues, we are monitoring very closely the existing risks and so on. And in order to ensure safety and security of the populations of those countries, in order to prevent any attempts to destabilize situation in the post-Soviet territory. And great contribution is made by countries bordering with Afghanistan and Russia being a reliable partner of all those countries in do everything in order to ensure security of the borders and so on, and CIS countries and as well as other countries like Tajikistan, which is one of the key partners when it comes to border security, and the 201 military base is deployed there, and these are guarantors of the stability and security of the whole region. Yes, please. Good afternoon. Sputnik, Afghanistan. Question. Recently, the Daniel Code the head of intelligence forces of the United States, said that in 2019 the official government of Afghanistan and representatives of Taliban will not be able to get the upper hand if this. Do you think that the United States have admitted the impossibility to eliminate, to fight and overcome to defeat Taliban? The answer. I always say that the decisions made by Washington on this track are quite short-sighted. They're not systemic. There is no overarching concept or perspective analysis. And the strategy has been changing over the last months. So I don't think there is a possibility to talk about final decisions taken by Washington. I would be quite careful with such words. I think that at this moment, this is so. Yes, please. Good afternoon. Question. Your Chinese counterpart from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China recently said that the United States was responsible for the terrible plight of the Venezuelan people. But if you look at this process of these color revolutions, as well as the personality of Juan Guaido, in 2017 he was schooled in the United States in Catholic University and then in Washington University, and it is known that he is a member of totalitarian Mason house. For example, Mikhail Saakashvili was also schooled there, and if you just look at the bigger picture, we may talk about that there is some kind of a center to train those people in order to undermine other countries. So probably Russia could organize a round table in order to look deeper in this topic. Answer. Like volumes are written about this topic, and there is nothing to talk about there. But now there is internet, and we know everything in all the details with photos and so on. The question is different. Well, despite the fact that everybody knows everything, that a lot of people in Venezuela do not understand that this solution that is inimical to their interest, to their country, that is sugar-coated, is something they should not take, but nobody thinks about it.
Perhaps it is a peculiarity of human nature not to learn from mistakes of your past, not to see things objectively, but to buy into some flashy words. As for the political figure you mentioned, I guess there is nothing new about that. Everything is clear and evident with regards to him. As for the functions of Russia's foreign ministry, what are you planning to do to support Maduro? I've already mentioned that we're going to support the constitutional order in Venezuela, to support and uphold the sovereignty of the state. We are going to do that on international platforms, within the Security Council, and in our bilateral and international contacts, in the declarations and statements we make. And that's a lot. What is done when it comes to the resolution and settlement of the situation, and this is not a question of some domestic conflict, but rather a question of foreign sponsorship and fueling of an internal crisis from beyond the borders. And we have done a lot in order to not let this situation deteriorate any further, as the sponsor wanted to see it, because those sponsors planned to see something swift happening, and if there will be no resistance, and if major players in many countries would not declare that they are against this situation, I guess there would be a transfer of power and a negative scenario playing out in Venezuela. The Armenian television, despite the fact that during the recent meetings of ministers of foreign affairs between Armenia and Azerbaijan, they talked about the people ready for peace. On the 3rd of February, they talked about providing modern weapons for their army, for Armenia, because Azerbaijan would never make their peace with the loss of territory, and thus this shows that they are prepared for war. So afterwards, can we talk about any peace if we only talk about Armenia? And without any direct participation in the negotiations, can we achieve any advancement in the resolution of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict? Our position remains unchanged. I guess the first part should be addressed not to Russia, but to the countries involved. We continue to act as a mediator in good faith, and we welcome the political contacts which we recently observed between Yerevan and Baku on various levels. We saw the constructive positions of the representatives of the two countries. I guess that's a good way to move forward. Yes? Good afternoon, TASS agency. Could you please comment on the situation with the disappearance in Ukraine of the Nord Captain Vladimir Gorbenko? Could the security forces of Ukraine be partial to that? I can only say at this point that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Russia's embassy in Ukraine are trying to determine all the details. As you know, the situation with Russian citizens who found themselves in a difficult situation abroad is of priority to us, and we closely monitor such situations. Yes, please. Japanese television TBS. In mid-February, on the margins of the Munich conference, there will be a meeting between the foreign ministers of Russia and Japan. At what stage is now the preparation of the meeting, and how is it going? The Japanese media, citing the sources in the government, several days ago reported that Sergei Lavrov is going to come to Japan in March or April. Does Russia consider the possibility of such a visit? And now as to the content of negotiations. The Russian side insists, and our minister, after he met with Minister Kona, insists that Japan should acknowledge the outcomes of the Second World War in full, including the sovereignty of Russia over the Kuril Islands. And Japan does not want to acknowledge these outcomes, but you should not speak for Japan as a whole. I mean, the Japanese side, well, the Japanese side can be different. We can talk about a consolidated Russian position because it takes into account the opinion of the executive power and the public and the scientists and the media, etc., etc. It's based on common principles, and there are no discrepancies. As for the Japanese side, I would approach it more carefully, as there are different school of thoughts there. So I have to, rectify you on this matter. So we see that negotiations are stalling. Is there any way out of the situation? Are any compromises possible? Perhaps Russia can change its stance or something like that. Let's start with your first question regarding the possible contacts with the minister. In accordance with the agreement reached at the meeting of the President of the Russian Federation and the Prime Minister of Japan, which took place in Moscow on the 22nd of January, they are now considering the possibility of future contacts between the Ministries of Foreign Affairs of the two countries. And one possibility is the upcoming Munich Security Conference. If both delegations will take place at the level of Ministers of Foreign Affairs in this conference, then such contacts might take place. But we have not officially confirmed the ministers' participation in the conference, so we are now working on that. As for your second question, that the Japanese media recently publish information about the possible visit of Sergei Lavrov to Japan, I can say at this stage, this visit is not on the minister's schedule as of now. If anything is to change, we will keep you updated. As for the negotiations, as for the stalling negotiations, I do not share this assessment. I guess that work is ongoing. We have talked about what we do not like about the current state of affairs, and first and foremost, those were public statements which were made with no regard to the negotiations taking place on various levels, and those public statements were undiplomatic and provocative in nature. We said that we were not content with such statements, and we do not want to see them again. I guess that the Japanese side heard us, and now we are working to resolve our differences. Yes, you please. The Pakistani media. I would like to specify a few points. During your briefings, you said that NATO is responsible for the airspace over Afghanistan. Are those helicopters indeed there, and who's responsible for those helicopters? And who's deployed in Afghanistan? Who, for many years, has been carrying out its military operation in accordance with the UN mandate, and at the same time they do not report to the United Nations Security Council? Those people are responsible. There are certain movements taking place, and we talked about them, and we understand that there's a link to militants, and nobody is saying what this helicopter is for, why is it unmarked. This again is a fact, but this is not a question to pose to Russia, but this is a question posed by Russia. RT, back to Venezuela. You've mentioned that the intra-Venezuelan dialogue, as Russia believes and as is rational, would be the best solution of this crisis. But the opposition does not want to get involved in this dialogue, and why the opposition leader is holding such a staunch position, and why his aides do not want to take part in this dialogue, why they demonstrate their position so openly. And as for the role of Russia, the ministry has already declared, and you have repeated, that you want to act as a mediator. But the situation is such that such a dialogue with the mediation of Russia is highly unlikely. Is Moscow considering any alternative ways to help overcome this crisis? And if the US scenario will actually be victorious, then our capacities and opportunities are limited, and those who support the official government, their opportunities are limited, and this wrong path can actually be taken. So, do you consider any additional measures? As for your question to the self-proclaimed opposition leader, and his unreadiness to engage in negotiations. Actually, he's not self-proclaimed. He was proclaimed by other forces. They have allocated some support for them, material and technical support, moral support, political support. They've provided all kinds of support in order to declare him as a leader of the opposition. I guess I should not remind to those who are closely monitoring the situation in Venezuela, but to those who are not following too closely, I can say that they previously sponsored another opposition leader, but their expectations fell short, and that's why they're now allocating all their resources to support Mr. Guaido. Everything that is being said abroad is actually being implemented. There is no doubt about that. There are indeed some domestic problems in Venezuela, but there is also a clear understanding and no doubt about the fact that the scenario of not allowing a consolidated intra-Venezuelan dialogue, the measures to hamper this dialogue are coming from abroad. Any small ancient states, monarchy, or any state, they have their own problems, their own issues, and any issues could be resolved through an intra-political dialogue. But you can actually kill this dialogue, you can halt this dialogue, you can make some problem as such that it cannot be solved. For example, we see that in Syria, we see that in many other countries around the world. That is why those leaders who were trained in the West, as we were told, and now they are at the helm of their position, and they are banned from participating in this intra-Venezuelan dialogue so as not to create opportunities for the resolution of conflict inside Venezuela and for overcoming their own crisis with their own means. As for alternative or other measures or opportunities, I represent Russia's foreign ministry. So what we offer and what we comment on and what is within our capacities for comments, those are measures of diplomatic nature. If you have questions to other ministries and you want to ask about their position, maybe you should refer to them. We believe that the possibilities of providing diplomatic counseling to Venezuela when it comes to overcoming this very complex crisis, and complex because it is now the focus of attention of foreign states, is not exhausted. And this opinion is shared by the countries in the region. And as we've understood, certain countries wanted to convene an international conference dedicated to resolving this issue. Yes, please. El País. As for Venezuela, you said that Russia is ready to act as a mediator. And my question, to be a mediator, you need to have good relations with those people who you want to reconcile. Does Russia have enough resources to ensure a dialogue between Maduro and the opposition? And please specify, have you tried to come in contact, or are you in contact with Uruguay and Mexico, especially considering the proposals they made? As for your second question, this is the proposal they presented yesterday, so we are now to discuss it, to specify the parameters, etc., etc. As for your first question, this is not about having good relations with parties to the conflict. The problem is that one party of the conflict is barred from coming into contact or saying anything that would help establish a dialogue with the other party. The opposition leader and the representatives of the opposition are barred from having any sort of domestic dialogue with the government. Apart from that, as you can well see, a number of Western powers have unilaterally started to declare the leader of the opposition as the legitimate interim president. And if this is being done, if that's the case, and they publicly make such statements, what kind of internal dialogue can we talk about, apart from creating the conditions and defining the rules of the game for the opposition leader, and within this game he cannot hold a dialogue with the government? They're also creating additional circumstances to not allow this dialogue to happen. And Russia has the potential and experience, for example, look at the Syrian crisis, the experience of talking to various members of the political playing field. And there are many examples like that. Take Syria, for example. We've had great relationship with the government, and we've supported a very valuable dialogue and one of the most valuable contributions into the launching of political process with the opposition. And I'm talking about the inner opposition and those living abroad. So Russia does have the opportunities and the experience to help boost a domestic dialogue within the country. And Syria is a very complex example because they have lots of political forces involved, lots of religious movements, etc., etc. And even when it comes to certain political position, they might be of the same view, but inner opposition and opposition beyond Syria sometimes had their differences, and we managed to unite them. An unprecedented example is the convening of the relevant conference, the relevant forum of political forces in Syria, which took place in Sochi, and everyone tried to convince us that that was impossible and would lead to nothing. But the conference did take place. This is one good example for you. So there are opportunities in place, just like with Syria. If they're going to try to hamper this dialogue further, if they would stimulate not an inner dialogue, but stimulate any sort of conflict and seed conflict within Venezuela, then this dialogue would become impossible. But we saw the same thing in Syria. Any other questions? Yes, please. Greek TV. The Prespa agreement. The ministry expressed some doubts as to the legitimacy of this agreement, and I would like to hear your comments as of today. Do you still have any doubts with regards to the legitimacy of this agreement? Will you acknowledge the existence of Northern Macedonia? Will there be discussion within the Security Council? And two more questions regarding Alexander Winnik, who was detained in Greece for some 18 months, a Russian citizen. And within the Security Council, they voted to extend the mandate of the peacekeepers in Cyprus. And there's the attempt to revitalize the negotiations. Will your ministry try to attempt to support this?
As far as your first question is concerned, as you know, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and you have quoted, this has made statements regarding Prespa agreement on numerous occasions, and you can find everything on our website. It's all relevant. And we have recognized the Republic of Macedonia under its constitutional name, and Moscow always has and still is supporting the idea that this question regarding the name of the state should be settled based on fundamentals acceptable for Skopje and Athens. And we believe that nobody should doubt that the Western countries were proceeding based on geopolitical agenda in involving Skopje in NATO as soon as possible, and not because they were interested in settling this bilateral contradiction. And as far as your second question is concerned, we monitor the situation around Mr. Winnik. We monitor the situation, and he was detained since late November 2018, and he is still on hunger strike. This is a reason for great concern, and Russian diplomats in Greece insist on assuring personal security for the Russian citizen and respecting his rights. And we are in contact with Greece authorities on all levels, and the Russian citizen should be returned to Russia. And as far as your third question is concerned, I think we've had comments of our permanent mission, but I'll double check and come back to you. Thank you. Did you press Japanese Information Agency in February? Apart from the talks between the Ministers of Foreign Affairs of Russia and Japan, we also expect a meeting of special envoys of the two countries. Could you say, do you know anything about the place and the dates of such meeting? We're also working on that. Yes, please. First question regarding the liberated Russian navigators. What is the situation with them? What is their state? And this week we also several times heard that empty Russian planes fly to Venezuela. First it was claimed that it was to evacuate parliamentarians from there, and now they say that it's to evacuate gold from there. Can you comment on this? I can say that in reference to your first question, it was about the seamen. We published a statement regarding them on our website, and I can congratulate all of us. They have safely returned home, and I don't have any further details on this case. But I have to remind you that in those dramatic days, or rather in the days of those dramatic events, in early January, just after the New Year's, about a week later, we heard voices of so-called experts that recommended even something like bombings, introducing armed forces. Thank everyone for their advice. We solve such issues based on experience and evaluation of the situation on the ground, as well as the circumstances of the situation. And I would like to assure you that every situation is specially monitored by the Ministry. And as far as this airplane is concerned, I have already answered to the questions we've received zone on the north of Syria. Will Russia support this operation? And today, the Turkish Defense Ministry delegation will be arriving to Moscow here today. This is a question to our specialists. There were political evaluations at the outcome of the meeting of Russian and Turkish presidents. They talked about this in detail, and Russian side has publicly stated its opinions, and they were also reflected in numerous comments of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I have nothing to add here. And as far as military operations are concerned, you should ask Ministry of Defense. Yes, please. German Perlov, Federal News Agency. Federica Mogherini stated that Europe benefits from INF Treaty, and she says that they hope that there is a means to save it yet.
So given this position of the European Union, how possible is maintaining this treaty, saving this treaty? The problem is that nobody hears Europe in the United States. I don't know if they listen to them or not, but they don't hear them, definitely. So on our part, we do everything possible to maintain relevance of this treaty. Remember our initiatives in the General Assembly, and you can see whether they were supported or not by Brussels. This is my answer for you. You can look into the practical steps Brussels takes to save this treaty. One of them was active work on the at the General Assembly. Yes, please. Vestnik of Caucasus. Yesterday we talked about Holocaust, and as part before his official visit to Israel, Poroshenko visited the Holocaust Memorial, and also they at the same time established a memorial to one of the Holocaust culprits. Could you comment on that he visits memorials to the victims and also establishes memorials to the other side? If we use political evaluations, it's very strange position of trying to please everyone at the same time. No one has ever been able to accomplish that, and it always led to tragic results. People are not just in politics and just heads of state claim that they will solve a complicated crisis, which is rooted in history, have to have a principled position on principled questions. The World War II, the Great Patriotic War, is a matter of principle. It's a very principled issue, and you cannot have a position of compromise there. You have to and you cannot look into the means of creating a state based on this compromising position. You should know the difference between compromising and unifying, creating this unifying agenda. And here they followed a different scenario. They have no principled evaluations and try to maneuver through compromises without maintaining principled positions on principled issues. And this has never led to anything good. Yes, please. Associated Press, I would like to hear your comment on the events that Russian hackers obtained access to the investigation into Robert Mueller and published it to discredit his investigation into the Russian intervention in Washington. If we talk about investigation, about prosecutor generals, about high-ranking American officials, we should probably determine the hackers, give their names, dates, some materials, and not just introduce this impersonal information, which definitely has some political side to it. I think from this Russian hackers we have to move on to names and dates and information. International Information Agency, News France, Bulgarian editing house. Question on the relations between Russia and Ukraine on 29th of January was published the report by Daniel Golds, the head of the National Intelligence of the United States, and there was a phrase that sounds more like an announcement of an increase in tensions between Russia and Ukraine in the Black Sea and the Azov Sea. And they also note that Russia will increase its military, political and other pressure as the elections draw closer. This is
information coming from the head of the American intelligence, not from journalists. Can we say that this is some information preparations for some future provocations? I understood. I haven't seen the materials from these reports. I haven't studied it in detail. But regardless of such, we can note that this campaign, as the election campaigns draws closer, has started, and this election campaign started with provocations, and these provocations, among other things, took place in the geographical points you mentioned. And obviously they will try to convince a certain part of the population, play to those Russophobic motives. And this campaign has been broadly supported abroad. This is something we also have noted. Do you have any further questions? Yes, please. Kurdish news agency, Farad News. We have two questions regarding the dialogue between Kurds and Damascus. Is it possible that Kurds will participate in the Astana negotiations? What exactly do you mean? At which stage is the dialogue between Kurd and Damascus? The dialogue on which issue? Our principal position throughout the entire inter-Syrian conflict crisis, all those events, was that there is a need to involve the representatives of the Kurdish movements in all processes of settlement, and we have conducted work not just with Damascus but other world players. And what specifically do you mean at which stage? Is it possible that Damascus will agree with Kurds to provide territory for ruling Damascus? Well, this is a question to ask Damascus, not Russia. But I'll double-check at which stage it is and contact you. Thank you very much. Till next time.